Hello everyone, my name is Zaria White. I am a senior in the History Department at UNC Asheville. Thank you for joining me in this virtual version of my presentation for the Undergraduate Research Symposium. I want to go over a few technical things first. I have included audio narration on each slide. The recording should begin playing once you click the right arrow or space keys to move through the presentation. Okay, on to the project now. My senior thesis project is entitled Charlotte Hawkins Brown, How the First Lady of Social Graces Uplifted the African American Race. Charlotte Hawkins Brown was an African American activist and educator from North Carolina. This project contains two major elements, an examination of Charlotte Hawkins Brown's career and an exploration of African American race politics of the 20th century. This includes the racial uplift ideology, which I focus on quite a bit, respectability politics, which is a subsection of the racial uplift ideology, and African American strategies of reform, which includes reform through education and reform through Black organizations, all of which Charlotte Hawkins Brown was involved. We'll start with some background on Charlotte Hawkins Brown. She was born Lottie Hawkins on June 11, 1883 in Henderson, North Carolina. She changed her name to Charlotte Eugenia Hawkins when she graduated high school to present herself as someone of importance. She took the last name Brown when she married Edward S. Brown in 1911, and she kept her married name after the two divorced. When she was 5 years old, Brown moved with her family to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she obtained an education that was not available to her in the South. After graduation, she returned to North Carolina as an employee of the American Missionary Association, and she worked at the Bethany Institute in Sedalia, North Carolina. Shortly after Brown arrived, the AMA removed funding from the Bethany Institute, prompting Brown to establish her own institution, the Alice Freeman Palmer Memorial Institute. She named the school after Alice Freeman Palmer, an early influence for Brown. She was only 19 years old when she established the Palmer Institute. On this slide, we have some background on the other main aspects of this paper, the Black middle class racial uplift ideology and respectability politics. These ideas come from historians Kevin Gaines and Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. First, we'll discuss Kevin Gaines and the racial uplift ideology. In the early 20th century, middle-class Black leaders formed the racial uplift ideology as a strategy to secure racial progress. The ideology included the belief that the endorsement of education and compliance with dominant society's cultural values would minimize white racism and provide opportunities for racial advancement. And we can tie Charlotte Hawkins Brown into this idea because she stated that some of her most treasured advice from her mother was this quote, "Try to make friends of those Southern white people, for they can make you or break you." Therefore, Brown emulated white Euro-American culture, such as having a strong Christian faith and following Euro-American social and cultural norms. I want to clarify that Brown did not do this as an act of accommodation to white domination. Instead, Brown and the other leaders of the racial uplift ideology did this because they knew it would make whites more prone to accept them as citizens. An aspect of the racial uplift ideology was respectability politics, which is a term conceived by Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. When promoting respectability politics, Black leaders condemned what they perceived to be negative practices and attitudes among their own people. For instance, Black leaders disapproved of behaviors such as frequenting bars, wearing leisure clothing in public, and being lazy. A major aspect of respectability politics was interracial cooperation, or the partnership of Black leaders and white philanthropists interested in Black reform. This is something Brown was heavily involved in. To tie Charlotte Hawkins Brown, the Black middle-class racial uplift ideology, and respectability politics together, I argue in my thesis that Charlotte Hawkins Brown, as an embodiment of the Black middle-class racial uplift ideology, emulated white Euro-American cultural values to subvert the oppressive system and encourage racial progress for African Americans. Over the next few slides, I will explain how Charlotte Hawkins Brown achieved racial progress by providing a few examples from my research where Brown was the embodiment of the racial uplift ideology. First is the Alice Freeman Palmer Memorial Institute, the school that Charlotte Hawkins Brown established. It is named after Alice Freeman Palmer, a white woman who invested in Brown's education when she was a teenager, and this was Brown's first act of interracial cooperation. A number of Northern and Southern white philanthropists invested financially in the Palmer Institute. Oftentimes, these philanthropists wanted African Americans' education to follow the model of instruction at Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, and so Brown offered industrial and domestic training to appease them. And as an embodiment of the racial uplift ideology and respectability politics, Brown taught Christian instruction and etiquette to her students. Again, Brown did not appease white demands as an act of accommodation. She did it to subvert the oppressive system. One of the ways she subverted the demands of her investors was to teach her students liberal arts courses such as music and art, subjects that normally would not be taught along with industrial training. Another example of Brown's interracial work and use of the racial uplift ideology to subvert the oppressive system was the publication of her book Mamie, An Appeal to the Heart of the South. For those who are unfamiliar, the Mamie figure is associated with enslaved black women who were often the nannies or caretakers for white families during the era of slavery. After emancipation, the Mamie figure became a grotesque caricature that misrepresented black women. If you've heard of Mamie, then that's probably what you picture when you hear the term. In 1919, Brown published a book called Mamie, An Appeal to the Heart of the South, and in it she details the story of a Mamie who stayed loyal to her master's family even after the Civil War ended. The Mamie's loyalty was unrequited, and it ultimately killed her at the end of the story. I apologize for spoiling the end of the book. Brown published this book with the support of her white ally Lula MacIver, and the two considered the book to be a tool to promote interracial cooperation because they believed it would encourage whites who felt remorse for the treatment of mammies during slavery to provide aid in creating educational opportunities for African Americans. Another example of Brown's racial uplift work was her response to the Mamie Monument proposal of 1922. In 1922, North Carolina Congressman Charles Stedman, on behalf of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, proposed a faithful Mamie monument to be built in Washington, D.C. Many black leaders, particularly women, opposed the monument. Brown sent a telegram directly to Congressman Stedman in opposition of the monument. True to her motive of racial uplift, Brown suggested that instead of building a monument dedicated to faithful mammies, the UDC should create a foundation helping to provide educational opportunities for African American girls. In 1941, Brown published a book about social graces, manners, and etiquette called The Correct Thing to Do, to Say, to Wear. She dedicated it to the youth of America as it consists of social etiquette rules that she taught at the Palmer Institute. In one of the chapters entitled Earmarks of a Lady, Brown detailed the behaviors a young woman should possess, such as being polite when entering or leaving a room, passing behind people, and saying please and thank you. According to historian and author Aisha K. Hardison, these behaviors that Brown endorsed helped to correct the negative stereotypes of black women as immoral. Because of this, Brown's promotion of Euro-American social etiquette helped to improve the image of African Americans. In addition, Brown delivered several speeches on the importance of culture, such as The Quest of Culture and The Negro and the Social Graces. These speeches were intended to teach the black public about Euro-American cultural values and proper behavior rules so that they could survive in the professional sphere. These speeches also served as tools to promote interracial cooperation because Brown argued that teaching African Americans to appreciate Euro-American culture and practice social graces benefited whites and blacks alike because it would bring the two races together. Brown's endorsement of culture gained her approval and support from whites, and that allowed her to speak to them about reforming race relations between blacks and whites. Now that I've explained Brown's racial uplift methods, I'm going to talk about my research process. Beginning with primary sources. The main types of primary sources I used are from Charlotte Hawkins Brown herself. I was fortunate to have online access to the Charlotte Hawkins Brown papers at the Schlesinger Library and the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University. This collection includes Brown's autobiographies, speeches, rewards, and Palmer Institute documentation. I was also fortunate to have access to Brown's two publications, Mamie, An Appeal to the Heart of the South, and The Correct Thing to Do, to Say, to Wear. For my secondary source research, I focused on books about Brown, the racial uplift ideology, and black race politics. I've listed a few of the titles I used here on this slide. These include Charles Wadlington and Richard Knapp's biography of Brown, Glenda Gilmore's book Gender and Jim Crow, about Black women's politics during the era of Jim Crow, and Kevin Gayance and Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's books about racial uplift in the 20th century. I wanted to conclude this presentation speaking about Charlotte Hawkins Brown's legacy. Brown earned several honorary doctorate degrees from institutions such as the Tuskegee Institute and Howard University, and she was rewarded several awards for her activism. When she was being considered to be the president of the National Association of Colored Women, William Pickens, a journalist and educator, argued that Dr. Brown was a contender because she made people respect Black women all over this country because Brown herself was the embodiment of Black womanhood. All of her work to improve the African American image did not go unnoticed. Dr. Brown passed away on January 11, 1961. The Palmer Institute closed in 1971. Today, the Palmer Institute's campus serves as the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum. The museum is well worth the visit if you want to get a glimpse of Dr. Brown's life and her career. Thank you to everyone for joining me at this virtual presentation of my senior thesis project on Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown and her work to ensure race progress for African Americans. The narration of the presentation ends here. The remaining 2 slides in the presentation are references and image citations. Thank you.